We last saw you in June last year, and we had quite a useful exchange, but it was quite obvious that there were a lot of matters that had to be allowed to evolve a bit, including your getting firmer into the saddle so that you would be in a better position to be able to answer the questions which the committee wants to ask. So I'll ask the first question, which is about the progress of negotiations and dissolution. The ninth round of TTIP negotiations will take place in the United States in April, including a specific EU-US SME workshop, and it is expected that negotiations will now intensify leading up to the summer. And of course we have a general election in between. What will your role be in representing UK interests in the negotiations during the dissolution of Parliament?
Well, Chairman, we still to get the exact rules imperative, but certainly I would attend any EU meetings during that period. I will. One of the advantages of being in the Lords, one is more available to do these things. So I know there's, for instance, an informal trade meeting in Latvia, which I will be attending. Actually, it's before dissolution. But any other meetings that are necessary to attend, I will be attending. We will continue, of course, to respond directly to EU matters. What I will, I think, be more difficult is to make public statements and comments regarding what is progressing. But certainly the communication and the role as a minister will continue in that period.
So you will be continuing irrespective of the dissolution of Parliament, you're saying?
Yes.
And on what basis would that be?
Well, I will remain a minister, and I will continue at BIS/FCO. So, for instance, if there was an EU Council meeting held, I would attend on behalf of the UK.
Okay, thank you very much. Grant Davis.
Can you just remind us what your projected timeline is for conclusion of CETA and TTIP, and whether you think you're going to get these sorted out before the American elections get going?
CETA and TTIP?
Well, for TTIP. When do you imagine we'll conclude? When do you aim to conclude TTIP?
The aim that was expressed by the Prime Ministers of a number of EU countries was to get an agreement in principle by the end of 2015. That's an ambitious target, but I think if one doesn't go for it, you certainly won't achieve it. So the aim that's the ambition set, and we'll have to see how it progresses and whether it goes into 2016. Unfortunately, with trade agreements, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, this actually, in many ways, has been to reach this stage in effectively now less than 2 years, is a lot quicker than some of the other trade agreements. But there's going to be, for instance, two additional rounds. So there's going to be round 9 and 10 before the summer, and I think that will be pretty critical, particularly round 10, in deciding the overall pace of progress. I'd love to have a crystal ball and be able to tell you the exact timing. But that's the aim.
Okay, thank you for that. So we're trying, if possible, we're trying to get it done within 2015, which is fairly difficult.
It's a
stretch, in terms of other timeframes, it is, of course, possible for us to opt out of the EU altogether. There's some people propose a referendum, and indeed the ECHR. Can you remind us how long we would be bound into TTIP for, should we sign it?
I think issues like that will have to be established. I don't think it's clear. It depends on.
But I put it to you that the answer to that question is 20 years, and it's based on the Energy Charter. And I put it to you that signing such a deal, certainly within a year, would be in breach of the doctrine of continuing sovereignty. So we are in a position that we can actually pass legislation to breach even the Magna Carta. But we're talking now, you're talking about signing something within the next year that would bind future governments for 20 years, and you don't seem to be even aware of that.
Well, no, the Energy Charter Treaty, if I'm right, was done well before Lisbon. And since then, competence has moved to the EU. I think it is a lot less clear when the EU is the key signatory on the trade agreement, if one is no longer part of the EU, as to what then happens.
The 20 years,
certainly notification of...
the 20 years is in CETA and 20 years is what's down in the draft for TTIP. And you're saying you didn't know that and that you're willing to sign something off in the next year that will bind the hands of many future governments for 20 years. What I'm saying
is this is an agreement between the EU and US or Canada. And I think it is, I do not agree with you that it is clear and straightforward in the event of an exit from the EU as to what would happen with EU agreements of any variety. I think that is something that has to be negotiated to understand what would happen. It is, notification is quite different from the fact that you will no longer be part of the organisation that is a key signatory to it. So I do not agree with you that it is clear and straightforward.
So I'm clear on this answer. What you're saying is, even though this agreement would bind us for 20 years, in the event we left the EU, you're saying we'd be relinquished from our obligations and the arbitration and the suing and all the rest of it that is embraced in TTIP.
That's not what I said. I said I think it is unclear how it progresses. I said I think it's unclear the nature and the terms of any exit from the EU, and it doesn't just apply to this. It applies to a whole load of our EU obligations and relationships as to how that exit would be done. Remains very unclear, and I think that'd be absolutely part of the negotiation.
Right, well,
in the meantime, the UK is and it is this government's aim would seek to continue in a reformed EU, and we should continue to negotiate agreements as part of that.
Okay. No, well, I think we all hope we're going to continue in the EU and it continues to reform and improve. So let's assume we're in the EU for a moment. Some of us may not. The concern is that we're bound in for 20 years in an agreement where judgments are being made by arbitration panels, that may chill the regulatory regime in the future. And I'm just being clear here. So you're happy within the next year to sign something up that would tie our hands for 20 years?
No, well, I was quite clear on the EU point. I think in terms of
I understand the EU point.
Sorry?
Yes, I understand the EU point.
Yes, the answer is not 20 years. However, we do
Right.
sign investment treaties, and we did prior to Lisbon sign investment treaties that did bind the UK for 20 years, and you gave notification if one wished to exit it. So this is no different to anything else. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Paul.
Could I just intervene at this stage? Because I think we could have an argument which could go on for a whole
moving
day.
on to the next question.
Just a moment. A whole day on interpretation. I think it would be useful if you would write to us on that point in response to what Mr. Grind-Davis has said, and then we can have an opportunity to look at the exchanges, because there are legal questions which arise here on which I would suggest that you can have different interpretations, but you can't actually, certainly in a session of this kind, come to a conclusion.
Can I just add one thing, Chairman, if I may, that the other point should make, whilst what I said is relation to all types of relationship with the EU, is that even if we reached an agreement with the US during the course of the next 12 months, the process for ratification would take a number of years beyond that. So TTIP would not be getting final ratification. I think it would be highly unlikely this side of a referendum.
You first.
That leads me on to the next question, really, because in that case, can you just remind us of the time frame for tying up CETA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement?
It's going through, it's starting the process of legal scrubbing just now. That will take some time, I think, to do. Probably legal scrubbing will be about 6 months. Translation is another, 12 to 18 of that order. So, and then it has to be ratified by each of the individual parliaments. The EU have said it will be a mixed agreement. So we are some number of years away from the overall adoption. There may be some interim on tariffs, for instance, put in now. I'd be very happy to give you, because it's quite all the stages that go through we've got written out. And I think I may have even submitted it last time of how long it will take for each of those processes. So, but the ratification process will not be for at least 2 years, something like that.
Yeah. But then you're certain it'll be a mixed agreement, which will need the ratification.
The EU, certainly the comments from the EU today are that this is a mixed agreement.
Okay, but would you agree that when CETA, because you were talking a moment ago about TTIP being sort of confirmed conceivably within a year, and obviously CETA predates that, and now you're saying that will take 2 years, so TTIP by implication will take 3 years. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
Now we're clear, it's not 1 year, it's 3 years. Okay, but on CETA, would you agree that CETA could basically be a Trojan horse for multinational companies to use ISDS to sue democratically elected governments? And the example I'd use obviously would be the one where there's a bilateral trade agreement between Singapore and Australia, and Philip Morris have established a shell company in Singapore in order to sue the Australian government, and presumably they could do the same thing through CETA to sue us, because everybody's worried about TTIP intimidating governments when really the wolves are coming through the back door, aren't they, through CETA?
Well, I think technically it's Hong Kong, not Singapore. I think it's Hong Kong.
That's Hong Kong,
not Singapore.
Hong Kong, that's right, yeah.
No, I would not agree, because actually the ISDS clause in CETA is a much tighter ISDS clause. I think represents far more the state of the art in terms of modern ISDS clause about, for instance, taking out some of the rights that companies have. For instance, the definition of fair and equitable treatment. I think treaty shopping is, which is what effectively you're referring to, is being narrowed significantly. The courts excluding what's called frivolous claims, for example. So actually, the ISDS clause in CETA represents a big improvement. One of the very important things to understand, because ISDS clauses are being presented as if there's something new. The UK has 94 ISDS clauses, excluding, I think, the Energy Charter Treaty. These 94 clauses have in total been in existence for 2,000 years. And the UK has never lost a case. Yeah. And actually, they're not perfect, some of these ISDS clauses. I think they could do with
come on to ISDS.
Yeah, well, sorry, I was being asked about it. But the answer to the question is no. It would not be. You asked, would this be a Trojan horse? And the answer, and I've explained why the answer would be no.
Could I just intervene?
The answer is no. So we're clear on this. It's no. So I'm saying, can they, inflict this ISDS on us before TTIP arrives? And surely the answer is yes. But you're just saying it's no.
I'm saying there's already 90 odd ISDS agreements that, in fact, are less good from a state point of view than CETA. CETA is a big improvement, and I think represents a modern clause that balances rightly the protection for discriminatory treatment against a company versus making sure that that governments have a very clear right to regulate in the public interest. And, so I'm saying there's already, if Philip Morris et al., and they might, wanted to try and treaty shop in another state, there already is 90-odd agreements to do that with. CETA would not be the one they would choose because it's, well, apart from the fact that Philip Morris's claim is in advance of CETA, but ignoring that, because the CETA clause represents, I think, a far better and more modern clause, and it's the one that should be the state of the art.
Could I just make a point with respect to what I've asked you if you'd be good enough to do, which is to write to us about the matters that I was talking about earlier in terms of the EU jurisdictional question. And bearing in mind that when you do that, if you were good enough also to, because Mr. Grant-Davis was asking about leaving the EU, that of course in that context, if that were to be something which might happen, naturally you'd need also to look at the fact that if this were to be done under, say, Article 50, you then have the negotiating period and also the question of whether or not you would use Article 50, because you might not. So without getting too hypothetical about it, I think it would be useful to have a framework within which, in answer to his question, we just get an analysis of how you think the situation would pan out in legal terms, although obviously you can't make a prediction at this stage about what would happen in practice.
If I can just ask, I think what would be helpful if the clerk to the committee would give us the the exact points
Yeah.
that they would wish us to respond to, because I think there's
Yes.
this is one of these subjects.
As I said, this is such a huge issue.
It is
that
indeed.
It could go on forever.
Yes.
So we will ask our legal advisor to prepare a question which will enable you to be able to write to us on it, so that we can get
I'd be
the parameters.
very happy to do so.
All right, go on. Yes.
Question 3 now. You mentioned that there would be what's called fair and equitable treatment in these arbitrations, but that's at the discretion of the arbitrator, isn't it? So it's quite sort of flexible. It's not like a court of law. So we are subject to future what an arbitrator happens to think according to the system rules we decide, that will then carry forward for 20 years and intimidate.
The definition is narrowed of what represents not being fair and what represents fair and equitable treatment, not being fair and equitable treatment within CETA. They have clarified that to give less flexibility to the arbitrators.
Okay. Can I just read out a question that the clerks and others want to have the answer to? What are the issues at stake in the reference seeking the formal opinion of the Court of Justice in respect of the partnership and cooperation agreement with Singapore, and how might that court case affect TTIP?
Well, this is a question which hasn't actually, I believe, that hasn't yet been put to the courts. I don't think yet the EU have talked about it, but they haven't yet done. The question of competence, where the question is, would the Singapore agreement be a mixed agreement? We shall see whether the Commission puts that question forward, but the Commission has argued that Singapore should not be a mixed agreement. The Member States and the Council, what has been round, have argued it should be. Now, the Commission have also said publicly that they expect TTIP to be a mixed agreement. So I think the answer, we don't know, of course, how the court judgment may come, but the EU publicly have said they expect TTIP to be a mixed agreement. So in that sense, they've already made the comment, whereas they seem to be distinguishing Singapore from the US agreement.
I think you want to ask a question about the health issue as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, I know that you've leaked something to the press ahead of this meeting, as you did with the Scottish Parliament.
Sorry, can I? Can I just?
No, just so we're clear. Yeah. What have you?
Yes,
let
the witness answer the question.
No, I have not leaked anything to the press.
All right. No, these news stories appearing about the status of the NHS in terms of TTIP.
Mr. Davis,
coincidentally have come out today.
Anything to any member of the press.
So there's nothing. You haven't put anything out ahead of this meeting, as happened in fact before the meeting before the Scottish Parliament.
And the thing I put out for the meeting with Scotland, what is it that I leaked to the press?
Yeah, well,
I've not leaked anything to the press on any occasion, I just object to the
Well,
statement.
let's move on to the substantive questions.
Just before we do, excuse me, it's just that we happen here to have BBC News Scotland politics.
I read it about half an hour ago.
I'm not taking a position on this because I don't know what the answer is, but Geraint Davis is entitled to ask the question. I'm simply asking whether or not, in relation to this, what you're saying is, not me, Gov, what's nothing to do with me, that is something that just happened somehow.
No, I'm saying it was complete news to me. I have not leaked, not involved, and actually, it doesn't. CETA is already there. It's. I actually asked. Apparently, it's a very early draft of the EU thing. But actually, the latest state-of-the-art CETA, and as you may note, the only quotes in it are from Unite. I just find the whole premise of the question actually quite objectionable. I'm very happy to answer what's the issue, but please I ask you to withdraw that unfounded accusation, because it's completely without foundation.
I know the presumption was we were handed this at the start of the meeting. It's in the media.
I got it about the same time.
So you're saying, as you say, you have nothing to do with this, and this is something put out by Unite before the meeting.
I don't know who it's come from. The only quote is from Unite.
Yeah. Well, we don't either.
So we don't know. I was just asking.
I'm not accusing you. I'm not accusing you of looking at. I would trust that you would not make the same accusation of me.
All right.
I'm more than happy to answer a question about.
No. Well, perhaps I'll ask a more substantive question.
That would be appreciated.
Than media here.
I'm not in these dark political
understand
arch,
the point. No. Well, let's talk about the substantive issue then, and that is whether the health service is protected both within CETA and TTIP. Would you agree that the bilateral arrangement with Finland does in fact have a much more copper-bottomed protection of the health service insofar as it protects all health and social care, whether public or private, from the trade agreement? And wouldn't you agree that that's something that we should really embrace in TTIP and CETA, and compared to that, we are at risk?
Well, let's take a step back, which is, first of all, what everyone has said about this. And we'll start unusually with the US. The US have said that public services... Bless you. Sorry?
So bless you to hear you sneezing. Yeah.
So I thought you were commending my answer. I appreciate it.
Sorry.
A man who needs a health service. The US has said public services are not part of the trade agreement, so they are happy to state that public services will not be part of TTIP. So that's the US statement. The EU, the previous EU Commissioner, and now I'll quote the current EU Commissioner, the previous EU Commissioner said the NHS is exempt, NHS has always been exempt, it is just used in your country for political purposes. That was the Belgian Trade Commissioner. The Swedish Trade Commissioner has written a very full letter to me, which I hope the committee has got. If they haven't, I'll be very happy to give it to you, which makes it very clear that the NHS is entirely well, I'll read the quote. She says, "Member States do not have to open public health services to competition from private providers, nor do they have to outsource services for private providers. Member States are free to change their policy and bring back outsourced services back into the public sector," etc. But you can, if you haven't seen the letter, I'm very happy. Let me continue. UK government made it clear. So all of them have stated publicly that health services, publicly funded health services, are not included. The reason they have made the statement is because of the exclusions we already have, which I believe are actually wider than the words NHS. So just to read the reservation in CETA, because as I said, CETA represents the state of the art. The EU reserves the right to adopt or maintain any measure with regard to the provision of all health services which receive public or state support in any form.
Yeah.
So that's and then we can then go on to further and further. That is very, very wide, and actually it's wider than using the words NHS, because we have things like the military health service, which would that be part of the NHS? Other health services provided by the government, but not directly through the NHS. The NHS is going to have regional forms, as was announced yesterday. Scotland, of course, has a different NHS. So I think that is very copper-bottomed.
No, but wouldn't you agree that there is some ambiguity here, because we have a mixed system in Britain, namely there's a mixture of public and private provision, and indeed the latest sort of coalition legislation enables more private provision in hospitals than had been the case. The issue then is for case law and for judges to say, well, okay, where there's already, the government's already opened a service up for competition, it might be cataracts or whatever it happens to be, it's already open up for competition, should that we allow TTIP into that? And that judge might not unreasonably say yes, and that then, the nature of that opens up the health service to TTIP competition. Wouldn't you agree?
No.
Oh, you wouldn't agree?
No,
that's amazing.
No, because it says the words "in any form." And understand, we have had...
That'll never happen. What I just said, it will never happen. We've got this on that a judge will not make that judgment about case law.
I think
the
wording "in any form," and also there's additional reservations beyond that. But understand, we have had GATS now for 20 years, which has similar wording, and have we ever had a problem with this?
Well, it's like saying you've never died. It's like you saying you've never died and you never will die. I mean, obviously, we may have not had a problem. That doesn't mean there won't ever be a problem. And there are intrinsic reasons to suspect a problem.
But also, when you have to ask, I'm sorry, I know I'm not allowed to. So I'll ask this as a rhetorical question. The EU Trade Commissioner, her chief negotiator as well, who's made very similar statements, her predecessor, all have been extremely strong on this point. And again, you can read her letter. Assuming, and I assume you are not accusing her of lying,
No, but wanting something to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen.
No, she said it's not. The NHS, her letter is very, very clear, will not be impacted by it. It's very clear, her letter, as her predecessor statements were very clear. And so, assuming that they, having done trade agreements for many, many years, are reasonably on top of what they do. I appreciate you may not trust a Conservative minister making statements, but this is a Swedish commissioner, her predecessor was a Belgian commissioner, her chief negotiator is Spanish, and they have all made the statements clear because the reservations are drafted very, very widely. They are drafted widely to make sure that irrespective of whether there is some, it is being put into private sector or not, it is in any form, it covers a very wide range of things. In times where we felt that there might just be an issue, there was a question over privately funded ambulances. The UK has actually added a reservation on publicly funded ambulances, for example. Now, actually, I'm not sure we actually needed it, but it just shows that we have done that.
I think we have actually covered this very comprehensively. You have the answer from the witness. It may be that there will be a continuing argument about this, but we can't resolve it at this meeting because we've heard a very clear statement from the Minister, and I think we now have to move on, otherwise we'll be here all morning on this one subject. Kelvin Hopkins.
Yes, Minister. Discussions continue about the alleged, potential economic benefits of the agreement and its impact on other countries, particularly the UK's historic Commonwealth trading partners and developing countries as well as China. Taking each of these points in turn, you co-signed a letter with other trade ministers to the new Trade Commissioner in the EU, stating that TTIP, quotes, will add over 100 billion euros to EU GDP, close quotes. Yet during questioning, you told the Business Committee that you were, quote, reminded of the J.K. Galbraith comment that the only purpose of economic forecasts is to make astrology look respectable, close quotes. Great hero of mine, J.K. Galbraith, I may say. Do you regret signing up to such an unequivocal statement in that letter?
I said to them as well that the letter, I was, I think, the last person of the 14 to sign it. I would prefer to have the wording up to. I would prefer that as the wording. I mean, actually, it could be more because it excludes the dynamic benefits that could arise from a trade agreement. The benefits would be substantial, in my view. There will be positive, not just for the UK, not just for the EU, but around the world. There has been, for example, our trade agreement with South Korea. We've seen a doubling of exports since that time. Now, a chunk of that's oil, but still, we've seen a very strong increase in exports. It's got to be good for the UK. So I think we'll see substantial benefits, and I believe, and there may be others who have a different view, that that free trade does enhance prosperity. I think it's sort of in economics tends to say, or else, and if we don't believe it, single market and every other trade agreement we should stop immediately. No, I don't regret. I wish the words up to were in there, but the 10 billion, and the reason I made the J.K. Galbraith quote is, people should not be saying it's definitely 10 billion. It's not going to be 12. It's not going to be 8. Not least, we actually don't know the final agreement. So, of course, it is an estimate and a forecast. Of course, it is. But will it be unreservedly a positive thing for the UK? I strongly believe that to be the case.
Could I just remind you, before you come on to the next question, Kelvin, could I ask you this? I'm just going to quote from what you said in the last session we had in June, which I'm sure you've looked at again. We were discussing this question, and then you said, I think the benefits are very substantial. I have to be absolutely frank and say that 10 billion is based on a lot of assumptions. It could be significantly one way, maybe it could even be the other. But the benefits of two of the three largest trading blocs is very important, very worthwhile, and present a great opportunity. Then you come on to the question of opening up government markets, and then you say there are a number of areas where the UK can benefit, the financial services. If we could get good agreement, this would help a lot. I cannot tell you the exact number until, well, I will never be able to tell you, but the assumptions will rather depend on the agreement reached. There have been estimates saying that it will be worth across the EU in excess of £100 billion per annum. It will take time to build up to that, but that is the sort of scale of the value. Certainly, I think it is going to be a very substantial whatever and a price worth pursuing. Have you any reason to
No,
revise that?
I think it was a fine statement. And I think remarkably similar. It's a big number. I don't want to say you can land on a pin.
But up to could mean from somewhere between 0 and 100 billion. Okay.
I think it would be very material.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it could be more when you take dynamic benefits into account, because none of the studies take a dynamic economic benefit.
There are serious people who take a different view to yourself, one of which is the Bertelsmann Institute, who concluded that the event of a far-reaching deal, so-called deep liberalisation, Canada, Mexico and Australia could suffer GDP losses ranging from 7 to 10%. That's an estimate by a respected institute. Clearly, these Commonwealth countries, and Mexico's not Commonwealth, but they're going to be badly affected.
Bertelsmann as well came up with a figure far greater than the equivalent of 10 billion for the UK. Bertelsmann came up with a much higher figure for the UK, from my recollection of a Bertelsmann survey. So in terms of I think we thought there might be bigger impact on some of these other nations. However, I don't think they were taking it against, for instance, having CETA in place, because bear in mind what we are doing is if we, for instance, reduce tariffs, we'll be bringing them down to pretty much similar levels in CETA. But the other thing I would like to see over time is Canada and Mexico join these agreements. So it's an opportunity for them to take advantage of it. Of course, there will be some, if you have effectively subject to some restrictions, a free market between the EU and US, some other countries that might have supplied in because, let's say, they were tariff-free in the first place, might be negatively impacted. But that will be offset, and I'm not sure the Bertelsmann study actually covered this issue, with a wider growth in the economy, because if you see a growth in the US and the EU economies, which represents together a large proportion of the economic powerhouse of the world, then that will actually pull everyone up. Canada and Mexico have a particularly close relationship, of course, because of NAFTA. But I would like, over time, to see, and it's probably best to wait till we get TTIP done, but to see Canada join it, see Mexico join it, see the Pacific Alliance countries of Chile and Peru and Panama joining it. And I think having a high level of standards and a free trading bloc will be in everyone's strong interest.
Well, setting aside these relatively richer countries, you told the Business Committee that you saw TTIP as a, quotes, a real opportunity for developing nations, close quotes. And yet the Bertelsmann Institute research suggests that all of the developing world, all of Southern and Central America, all of Africa, for example, all of Russia, China, would all suffer losses of GDP from this agreement. So it's not just, having all of those in, would that help them as well? I mean, would it make the whole thing meaningless?
The Bertelsmann was going to that there may be some trade diversion. I actually think the trade diversion is going to be pretty small from developing countries, because the products that they do are not the same products that are exchanged usually between the US and the EU. They are, motor vehicles, for example, aren't necessarily a big export from Africa. Commodities are, and the like. So I think there will be very little trade diversion. What I think the Bertelsmann study didn't include in its analysis is the impact and positive impact from rising GDP that would result, and also the positive benefits from being able to sell to a single standard rather than having to produce multiple standards. And bear in mind, a lot of Africa has actually quite small companies, and they are the ones who have the greatest difficulty in meeting multiple standards. So then there has been other studies which have said there will be a small diversion, negative, and then positives because of GDP. And we believe that. But the other thing I should really stress, you don't take TTIP on its own. We are also trying to pursue multilateral and plurilateral agreements. So, for instance, the EU has recently concluded or nearly concluded EPAs with a lot of these countries, which give them tariff-free access into the EU. So, and also, DFID, under this government, we've become the second largest provider of aid in the world, and providing around about £1 billion, I think, sub-Saharan Africa in assisting with improved trade. That sort of assistance will way offset any negative impacts on TTIP. But the TTIP impacts, I said, will be very small in diversion, and I think will actually be positive in terms of the opportunities it presents.
Well, some of the figures listed for African countries suggest that a bit of aid won't make much difference. The most extreme case, Guinea, would lose 7.4% of its GDP. But I'll go on to another question. What is your assessment of how it...
I haven't quoted I should say I haven't quoted Berstmann in terms of the gains to Europe either.
The several African countries, all substantial losses.
But I haven't quoted, they have much higher gains to Europe, and I haven't quoted that because I think I'm not sure it's the best study in the world. But anyway,
okay, but you did specifically say it would be an opportunity for developing countries, which clearly it's not, it's negative. But another question, what is your assessment of how TTIP will affect trade relations with China and possibly Russia as well?
Yeah, well, Russia trade relations at the moment will probably have some other issues that I think they'll be more front and central. But let's talk about China. Again, we do not see this as an exclusion. In fact, we are progressing bilateral investment treaty with China. We have, in fact, I think, written or just about to write to the Scrutiny Committee about progress on that. Is that we can do. We can update on that. But we have said that we would like to pursue a free trade agreement with China. The UK has been at the forefront of saying that. I've been in China myself, making such statements as with the Prime Minister. And we see one should pursue multiple paths, as well as with Japan, for example. So we've got a Japanese free trade agreement that could well happen in the same time or even sooner than TTIP, which doesn't tend to get any focus, but could be worth substantially for the UK. So the UK will pursue, on one side, the deepening and widening of the single market, and on the other side, a series of bilateral EU trade relationships, plurilateral things like TISA, for example, trading green goods, which are really important, and also multilateral via the WTO. So one should try and progress in as many possible areas as possible, because trade will add to prosperity of the countries that open up their markets, and certainly there's been plenty of studies to show that's the case. I think the World Bank said that countries who liberalised and opened their markets grew, I think, 3 times the scale of ones that did not.
I mean, I'm passing my final question, but just an aside. Bertelsmann estimates that Japan, you mentioned Japan, would lose 5.9% of its GDP. I think they'd be quite annoyed about that. But
well, it's interesting. I went to Japan, and I have to, who, by the way, are doing TPP as well as potentially an EU agreement, and not one single person. I was in Japan a couple of months ago, and not one single person in Japan mentioned their concern about that. What they were very interested in was the completion of TPP and also a free trade agreement with the EU that they thought would benefit their economy tremendously, and it's actually the aim of Abe to have the vast majority of Japanese trade under free trade agreements. Certainly the Japanese government is signing up for free trade.
Perhaps they hadn't seen the Bertelsmann report, but my final question...
perhaps they don't believe it.
My final question, is it realistic to expect TTIP to deliver, quotes, substantive regulatory convergence, close quotes, given the inherent difficulty of the subject and the position of individual US states? If so, substantive regulatory convergence, inevitably, would it mean a dilution in EU consumer protection?
In answer to the second question, no. Again, the Commissioner has been very, very clear that they will not sacrifice high standards. And I think, to be fair, I don't think the single market, there's been this statement, a convergence means a race to the bottom, that I've heard from some people outside this room. Yet the single market didn't lead to lower standards, actually led to a single high standards. There may even be some discussion as to whether it's led to too many standards, but certainly that was a push up, not a push down. In answer to your earlier part of the question, it will be difficult. This is not easy. If this was easy, we would be doing it quicker. However, what we are seeing progress in a number of areas. There'll be some areas such as bulk chemicals. I don't think we're going to make progress on. Because, and the EU said, because the reach where the EU regulations are so different from the US and the thesis behind it, we aren't going to get convergence. In other areas such as testing of pharmaceuticals or the car industry and what's in there, I think we could make a lot of progress. So it's going to be different by sector. And then over time, to find ways of when new regulation is coming up, that it isn't different just because. And I'll give you a little example, which came from a medium-sized business, small business, that made some electrical products. The EU and the US have a different rule about the colour of wires inside their product. And the practical effect of this is they have to make 2 different products. Now, it's not that the red wire is more secure than the blue wire, and also, by the way, the other problem was that the US tests the product, tests the individual components outside the product, where the EU does it inside, and the net result is that US products for the same product are 15 to 20% higher. And it's that sort of thing where there was no reason for the difference, they just came from different backgrounds. So I think there's real opportunity, and will particularly help small businesses, but a lot of it is not going to be easy, and I absolutely share the comment about not easy. But most things that are easy are less worth doing than things that are hard.
I could,
to misquote somebody.
We could debate this for a long time. But one final question, and they're not meant to impugn in any way your sincerity, which is obvious. But you had a distinguished career in business as chief executive officer of a major corporation. Is your view of all this coloured to an extent by the fact that you come from the corporate world rather than from the consumer world, or from the public sector, or wherever?
Well, I come from a world where I sold to a lot of consumers, and so I think quite hard about consumers. I had 12 million of them at BT, at Dixon's for a long time, had a lot of them. So I actually have pretty close to consumers and spend a lot of time with small businesses, and so I'm pretty close to what they say and what they do. Am I pro-free trade from my background? Yes, I am, because I trade in 170 countries. I saw the problems. I saw the fact that consumers didn't get the choice they wanted because of unnecessary barriers to trade. So does my past experience have an impact on me? Probably does, but much the same way virtually my whole family are medics, and they have an influence on me as well. And one of the reasons I'm called Lord Livingston of Parkhead isn't just because of Glasgow Celtic playing at Parkhead. My dad was a GP in Parkhead for 40 years. And so your background, of course, causes some impact. But I think I've seen small businesses, consumers, and large businesses, and how all of them produce and receive suboptimal outcomes because of the lack of free trade. And what I've seen is the world will benefit from more free trade rather than less.
What about protecting workers' rights in those countries as well?
So I had over 100,000 employees. I have a very good relationship with CW, who did very well when I was the CEO of BT. So I believe very strongly in workers' rights and support. And I know that US workers, they may have some different rules around it, but they won't be affected. We will not cause a change in US worker rights. The US will not cause a change in European workers' rights. But there are many countries in Europe that would probably quite like if they could change their pay rates to American pay rates. But the workers' rights are not going to be affected on either side of the Atlantic. We have a different view, as indeed bear in mind we have a slightly different view from other parts of Europe about exactly the way that workers' rights can affect employment levels, and maybe that's the reason the UK is one of the lowest levels of unemployment in Europe.
Yes, I'd like to just come in on this because we're dealing here with the question we've asked about substantive regulatory convergence. You've got, in the United States, you've got the commercial rights clauses. In the single market, you've got arrangements which are bound within the EU in respect to the internal market. We have financial services, and we have the problem, which I think lies at the root of this, of the fact that in order to make any changes in any EU law, you have to have unanimity, unless everybody is prepared to work together, which would be unanimity, and it could be done by agreement. Peter Mandelson, when he was Trade Commissioner, this is a few years ago, said that he thought over-regulation represented something of the order of 4% of GDP over the whole of Europe, and there have been studies to demonstrate from the IEA and various other bodies that the over-regulation in the UK, which comes from the EU, could represent something of the order of £6 billion a year. I think the British Chambers of Commerce have given figures of that kind. Now, the real question surely is this, that if you sit there and you are making agreements with all the other member states, and in particular, because you're representing an EU position in this respect, and you have to deal with the United States. Against all that background, if you come up with agreements that you're going to amend or to bring convergence and regulatory burdens, you will also have to face the fact that you have to get that through the EU legal framework as well. So it may be one thing to negotiate on behalf of the EU in this respect, but the bottom line is that you're going to have to get every member state to agree to any changes in the regulatory burden in order to achieve the changes of the acquis communautaire. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, we all recognise it's very difficult, but do you really regard that as really getting near to impossible? Because the regulatory burden, frankly, has not gone down. It's been going exponentially up over the last 20-odd years.
Well, I have some sympathy about your comment on the regulatory burden, both national and EU-wise, and actually there's a very good compete principles that came out, I think were excellent. We're actually seeking to force the EU to consider independently the regulatory burden and proper impact assessments and exclusions for small businesses and the like. So I think there's some very good work going on there. I mean, bear in mind, of course, that every country, and I'm going to ask Paul to add to this, every country will have to agree, because we expect to have a mixed agreement, so you will all actually need, for all the changes involved, unanimity. Yes, anyway, so it's going to be, unanimity is going to be needed, whatever. I'm not sure that all the changes are necessarily going to be requiring changes to the acquis in total. But you will actually require unanimity for the agreement anyway. But I don't know, Paul, if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, I'm very interested to hear what you say.
I can add to that. There are a number of components of this agenda. Part of it is around mutual recognition of existing standards. Some of that won't actually require changes to regulation as such. Some of it is around removing duplications of inspections. More of this is on cooperation of regulators, and again, that's a component that doesn't require a change in the law. And then a final component that I would add on top of that is the future-looking provisions, where actually we can do more to make sure that there isn't a divergence of regulations unnecessarily whilst maintaining high standards. And that's particularly important in sectors of the economy where there is rapid technological change. So, for example, in autonomous vehicles, what we want to avoid is two different sets of regulations being created, not for any particular safety reason, but just because we have two systems across the Atlantic that don't look at how each other is doing things.
Could I just add one final point? I'd recommend that you read, perhaps, an extremely interesting article by Roland Valbel, Professor of Economics at Mannheim University, where he describes the mechanics of regulatory lawmaking in Europe as being regulatory collusion. I'm not going to go into it now, but I strongly recommend you look at it because it's very interesting and bears in on the manner in which the voting arrangements are done through the Council of Ministers. And we've taken evidence in quite recent past from Simon Hicks of VoteWatch to understand how you would be able to make the changes. It's actually, and I'm sure I'm not telling you something you don't know, but I'm putting it on the record, the manner in which consensus is arrived at and who gets the advantage and whether it happens to be, say, Germany or France or whether it's other countries, depends on the manner in which those arrangements are entered into, and it's not just on the voting system, because the voting system is effectively supplanted by the consensus because they know what the outcome is going to be. So I just put that on the record. I'm sure you're aware of it, but it is something which could bear in on whether or not you achieve your objectives. Now, I think we must move on to transparency and access to information, unless Mr. Geraint Davis would like to ask one last question.
If I may, just a couple of very quick supplementaries. Firstly, on the first set of questions, there's been a suggestion that, I mean, obviously you've said that the advantage of TTIP is about free trade and bringing big economies together and helping the world. But wouldn't you agree there's a case to be made that the free trade is more free trade amongst the rich nations and a blockade against the developing nations? And not only will they face tariffs, but also barriers of standards, and the econometrics that we've heard suggests basically it's a sort of a barrier against the developing nations. And you yourself caricatured developing nations as being interested in commodities when their real interest, of course, is in added value and in more advanced products to get more profit, isn't it?
Well, no, I said one of the major exports at the moment is commodities. which
Yeah.
is true. I was in Ghana just a few days ago visiting an excellent added value in fruit that I'm sure would like to sell into the US as they do across Europe, but there's different rules in the US from Europe, so they can't do it. British company that has a setup employs hundreds of people, so if you buy in Asda or Waitrose your prepackaged fruit, it comes from this factory in Ghana, one of the few pieces of added value that goes on in Ghana, and you're absolutely right from the point of view they'd like to see more, but you're absolutely wrong, so no, I don't agree, in talking about a blockade. There's already been, the EU has a number of asymmetrical agreements with developing countries that allow them effectively tariff-free access into the EU. Without the corresponding on the other side. So actually there is a big reach out from the EU to provide tariff-free access. Secondly, that we do see going forward continuing to push in other areas, and particularly in trade, aid for trade, helping them improve particularly intra-African trade and get away from subsistence. I possibly would, and maybe end up agreeing with the committee on the subject of things like food subsidies and the impact that has on Africa as being a big problem. That unfortunately is not within the remit of this study, but that I think is maybe the biggest problem. But the EU has been very active and very proactive in trying to effectively create a close to tariff-free situation for these countries. And I think it should be commended for it.
And on standards, can I simply ask, that obviously we understand the case of harmonisation that you've put in terms of wires and all the rest of it, but the problem is in moving forward, the mechanisms the Chair referred to and how to change them, if there is innovation and there's a better way of doing the wires, for example, then aren't we basically hamstrung by the regime in years to come? And secondly, how do we adapt to quite powerful interests in things like chlorinated chicken, GM products, nanotechnology, things that in the future may threaten our public health? How do you see the regime emerging to protect us from lower standards in new products that are yet to occur?
The EU's regulatory regime, whether you like it or not, will remain in process. What we are trying to do we'll come back to chlorinated chicken, which is one of the myths put around about TTIP. But the EU mechanisms to try and have regulatory cooperation and discussions to try and make sure as new changes come around, they're consistent. Unless, of course, we're in a position where fundamentally the EU and the US just disagree about, over the scale, so that we don't have unnecessary divergence, that any divergence is necessary. And we'll take the chlorinated chicken, and it usually goes together with hormone-fed beef. The EU Commissioner has made entirely clear that whilst the US allows that, the EU will not allow that, and therefore it will not come into the EU. And it's an example of where actually we just have different rules. Now we can have a long discussion about GM more generally and about the EU position, which has a different, actually different countries are adopting different positions. But it is not TTIP that will change the EU's position.
Well, we're not going to get on to GM this morning, I can assure you.
We don't have quite enough time for that.
We're now moving on to transparency and access to information. Andrew.
Thank you, Chairman. On transparency, ironically, for something that many people think sounds dry as TTIP, I have had quite a few constituents about this, and apart from ISDS, transparency is the thing that they've expressed most concern about. And there does seem to have been some increased emphasis on transparency, particularly following the publication of the mandate last October and the further release of new tech papers this year. What do you propose to deposit in Parliament for formal scrutiny for the remainder of the process through the negotiations? And if I can just add something onto that, and how will you make that information available to members from the start of the new Parliament on May the 8th until this committee has been appointed, which I think, if I'm right in saying, this committee usually tends to be quite late in terms of appointment compared to a lot of other committees, so it could be as late as maybe even, September, I think it was last time.
Okay. On transparency generally, the EU would make the point that this has been the most transparent trade agreement ever. And people would make the point it hasn't been transparent enough, and both of these statements have truth in them. But sometimes when people talk about that it's all done in secret, and the reason I asked my prop, these are the documents that the EU have released publicly on the negotiations. Sorry?
Well, that's not many, is it, considering the complexity? It's just a prop for you. I mean, that isn't much, is it?
Actually, it's rather a lot.
Mr. Chairman, Hansard finds it difficult to record props, so I think it's worth recording. There are three.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond, for clarifying that. He held up 3 lever arch files. Yes, doesn't have stage directions in Hansard normally. But they have done, and since Cecilia Malmstrom, the new commissioner, came in, she has made, I think, a lot of steps forward in improving transparency issued. One of these folders are what she's released since she's come in, and she has announced some very substantial changes now to improve transparency, particularly for MEPs. Now, however, that is in relation to MEPs, and one of the things that we are seeking to do is to have the same access for MPs as MEPs.
That will please Mr. Great Davis no end.
Yeah, no, I want all those folders. Yeah.
You're now going to get...
Well, no, they're all public. You've read them, presumably.
Can we just
carry on. I'll carry on. So, for MPs, in addition to that, we would like to see this scrutiny making available to the chairman of or the scrutiny committee further documents. And one of the things we would, if the chairman is willing before dissolution, is actually discuss with him some proposals that we would like to do to increase the ability of this committee to have access to raise them to the level of similar to that would go to the top officials, etc. So we'd like to discuss that process. Now that is different, I think, from the particular point you were asking about, then laying them before Parliament, therefore they become available to everybody. The things that will be available to everyone are what the EU makes available to all the public in the 28 nations, and what they're trying to do, and what we've pressed them to do, is basically make available to the public those things that would not harm the negotiating position. I think it is not unreasonable, in fact, in the interest of the citizens of the EU, not to release things that, for instance, set out this is our bottom line position. So I think you'll get a lot more released from the EU. Of course, we'll continue to write to this committee with updates and the like, and that will be, and we will continue to participate in public debates and there'll continue to be press conferences after each round and public consultations. So there'll be all of that. So I think you're going to see a big step up in the level of transparency, and it's interesting when we talk about a lot of the clauses and etc. The other thing we have is, of course, CETA has been published, and as I said, CETA for a lot of this represents the state of the art. So people have a lot of wording. They can decide whether they like it or not. But I know there's still a thing about this is still secret. But I think there's been some major step forward since we last met.
I mean, there's been some warm words from the department on the 16th of February. So are you saying that as MPs we will have the same level of access as MEPs?
That is what we are seeking. That is the position we are seeking to achieve.
Right. Yeah. And returning to the other question, what about from the 8th of May until this committee gets reformed? How are we going to deal with that? Because there'll be 650 MPs, some of them will be new, and it's a difficult time.
We will continue to write to the chairman of the committee, although we won't know who the chairman of the committee is, during the period. Sorry?
There won't be one until...
No, but so they have got the documents can be picked up by the committee when it's formed. So what we won't do is sort of stop and say there's no committee. My understanding, and I will defer to Paul if he's got anything to add, but we will continue to write as if the committee exists. So there isn't a gap in documentation. That the continued documents come to the committee and they have it during that period. Paul, is there anything?
I think we just follow the normal procedures in this in writing, and you can pick up the documents when a new committee is formed.
Yes, I think the short answer is, first of all, it would be appreciated if now you would write specifically stating what you've just said as a proposal to the committee, because then at least it's on the record in a coherent form. Okay. And the second thing is that as respects the continuation in the vacuum between this committee and the next committee, I think it would be very important to try to reduce those, if I could address my remarks to the official here, Mr. Griffiths, that they're done in a manner which will enable the clerks and the advisors to be monitoring this as it goes through, because what happens, and I can assure you that when I took over, when I was elected as chairman of this committee, we were presented, as Andrew Bingham was saying, it was in September that year, with a pile of documents, which was, if I can also put this on the record, which was nearly a foot high. And it's very important when documents are being fed through to make sure that they're done in an organised manner with an indexing system to enable the incoming chairman to be able to get a clear picture. So on the front of it, one would hope we would have bullet points, summaries updated, so that the whole thing is a coherent whole. And also to make sure that the information is available to all members, because nothing can be published by the committee until a new committee is appointed. So if we get that on the record, then you could deal with that in the letter. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm happy to do that. And
now I'm going to move to ISDS. You want to ask one question?
Transparency, just very quick. I want to know, and obviously you've helpfully explained that there's been more access for MEPs, you'd like to see it for MPs. In terms of the actual agreement, it's being done by negotiators, and my understanding is that the European Parliament will have to vote yes or no, and then it's ratified by state parliaments. Do you think that the European Parliament should have the opportunity to make any amendments or suggestions when it considers the deal, or do you think that would be inappropriate?
Well, in fact, even before the European Parliament, then the Council has to approve it before it gets to that stage.
And it happens then, yeah.
I think the US has the same issue, and this is why they go for the fast track authority. The problem when one negotiates a trade agreement as a whole, then someone says, something, I don't like, I like their tariff cuts, I don't want ours. You can't pick it apart. That being said, even because each section is done over time, and there's some draft text sometimes published, etc. Certainly there's information that comes out. People do have a chance to input through the process, so I don't think you don't reach suddenly. There's nothing, and then ta-da. Because draft proposals are put forward and things like that. So there's a very active process, and I certainly have met with a number of MEPs, and I know the Commissioner spends a lot of time with MEPs. So I think there's a lot of interaction.
So can I ask then?
I think it is. I think a short answer to your question is I think it's right. You either say you take it or you don't take it.
Right, but do you think, given that there's going to be opening of transparency, as you've said, for MEPs and MPs, in that process, should there be a process where we can engage and make suggestions so that in the dynamics, those are taken on board but by a different route, so that those can, rather than suddenly merging on the final day, yes or no, take it and leave it, and then it's slightly imperfect.
I think that's a natural process, and not just for MPs and MEPs. It's why there's consultations, for instance, a number of things. You can't guarantee, of course, that all suggestions will be taken on board, not least that they may be entirely contradictory to each other. But that will be the process of ongoing getting feedback from all interested parties, from NGOs, from small businesses, from consumer groups, from MPs, from MEPs, etc., etc.
And one last point on the mechanics and process. When I said all members, I meant all members of Parliament, not just this committee, so that for practical purposes, and as your current minister, we don't know what the outcome of the general election is going to be, because of the necessity to maintain a continuum, because the process is continuing in any event. The issue of presenting information to the committee, that is to the committee clerks, in the meantime in the coherent form in which I've just mentioned, it would be helpful. Also, to make sure when I say all members, I mean all members of Parliament, so it would go into the library of the House of Commons. So as long as we get that, and you can put all this into the letter you write to us, because I think it's worth reflecting, and I think Mr. Griffiths will be able to assist in that respect, because this is, in a sense, between officials in the absence of having an elected committee. So I just want to get that on the record. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Minister, for coming in. It's much harder to be an effective scrutineer of something that one thinks is fundamentally important and urgent and wants the government to get on with and push through. And actually I'm a believer in unilateral free trade, so the faster you get this done, the better. That's why Mr Davis's question is probably more pointed and effective than the soft ones I'm going to serve up. But I want to come on to the investor-state dispute settlement issues, partly because I think there's a lot of misinformation around concerning them, and part of which you've mentioned in your earlier answers. But the discussion between the Commission and Member States about the inclusion of these clauses in TTIP, and the extent to which you'll be willing to publish the UK government's contribution to the process at the same time as it is submitted to the Commission, rather than after the event, so that the position on these regrettably controversial issues can be considered by this committee, by other people, particularly on things such as frivolous claims and when a state may have to pay costs or compensation.
Well, in terms of process, there wasn't a separate UK government submission into the consultation. And we, of course, contribute via the Council and give our views and have our feedback on ISDS in general. And I think CETA reflects a number of those contributions. And what we wish to see is an ISDS clause that has the right sort of balance, that also we are very in favour of the unilateral transparency. So when people talk about secret agreements, it's nonsense, because actually, you know, both the US and the EU have already moved on that thing. So we think, you know, I think the government's view is that that what was agreed in CETA has gone a long way to making the improvements necessary to ISDS. But there's probably still some work to be looked at, for instance, in the how the panel of arbitrators decided whether there should be an appellate mechanism, for example, and issues like that. But I think if you say that you know, we will discuss with the EU what their views on the comments, but I don't know, Paul, if there's anything you wish to add to that.
There's ongoing discussions with the EU about potential further reforms to the mechanism. And we do that regularly.
So there won't be. There's not going to be a formal response to the EU.
So there's not going to be a document that we could scrutinise. It might be helpful, because my view on it is that there's a lot of misunderstanding on the ISDS clauses, that they are perfectly rational and they basically give the protection to foreign companies that national companies have, and they don't affect regulation. But that is not the perception. The perception is that they will allow aggressive foreign companies to completely change the law of the land, and that the more open the government can be about the positions it's taking, any red lines that it may have, any improvements that it's getting from CETA, may be very helpful in assuaging this public disquiet, because however much I think these things are perfectly reasonable, all of us are getting letters saying that people are very worried about this particular aspect of TTIP, and I just wonder whether even greater openness would be helpful, and beyond that, a real push by the government to explain what the effect of the ISDS clauses are and why people can be comforted.
I certainly have sympathy with your comment that people have got concerns partially because they're being misinformed. I think there was some institute that said the well-informed but ill-minded are misleading the ill-informed but well-minded on this, and we have tried, clearly not enough, to make it clear as to what ISDS should have and not what. I think maybe we should write to committee and say how we think CETA has improved matters and some of the issues we can consider going forward. You'll excuse us, we don't write our bottom line positions on everything, as clearly that wouldn't be in the interest of I think people. But we do take the view that the focus, you know, for a start, ISDS cannot override a government's right to regulate. It is about discriminatory treatment, it is about compensation where there's discriminatory treatment. The fact that the UK legal system is a strong legal system, and that as a government we do not tend to nationalise without compensation, for example, is the reason we have not lost a single case in all this time on ISDS. And I think, speaking to quite a few other Western European countries, neither have they. But we do think there are improvements, and we should go through within CETA and maybe some of the things we want to look at beyond, and I'll happily submit a letter to this committee that sets out what we think some of those improvements are and how it can be done. But we certainly do not believe that ISDS clauses are something UK people need to fear, partially because they're not new. And it's being progressed, and it appears to be the only concern is because people fear the US, and as was pointed out very expertly by Mr Davis, obviously, that indeed already US companies, if they should so wish, can sort of effectively treaty shop. So there isn't, actually having a better agreement is in everyone's interest. It also should be remembered that EU companies have actually initiated a lot more actions than US companies. Some people do like to demonise the US. It's not a view that I take.
I prefer demonising the EU, but we'll leave that.
Sorry?
I
well, it depends which
demonising
side.
the EU, but
sometimes both. I'd be very happy to write with the setting out how CETA has, I think, made significant improvements to the clause. And of course, as one of the biggest investors around the world, it does benefit UK companies of all sizes.
because my concern would be that the misunderstandings here risk derailing the whole treaty, that there seems to be the one area that may most threaten ratification both in the European Parliament and potentially even in the national parliaments.
I think that is right. There has been some step forward. I mean, it is interesting that some of the countries who are supposedly most against ISDS are the ones who have the most number of ISDS agreements with other EU members, which is an interesting point, and have sought to rely on it but don't want the US to have it. We are seeing, I think, a bit of a change in the understandings. But sorry, you were going to say, Paul.
I was going to say that we've already done a leaflet on ISDS that we've shared with all members of Parliament, and we're happy to send that over again straight away.
Any other question? Just a minute.
No, that's fine.
That's it. Great.
And I should say, the start point and genesis of our questions, the difference between me and Jacob Rees-Mogg is I do support trade, so we're clear on this, but not, blindly going in and opening us up to all sorts of liabilities. And on that, can I just ask, in simple terms, given that the EU and the US have got, mature and established legal frameworks with company law, contract law, etc., why do we need ISDS at all? Couldn't we just do it without it?
There's a few points to make. First of all, of course, this is not unique in terms of having supranational decision. I mean, we do sign up to, you mentioned the European Court of Justice just a second ago, or rather in the conversation, I think you mentioned the European Court of Justice, or somebody did. We also have things like state aid rules, etc. So this is not peculiar, first of all. Second of all, the US already has ISDS clauses with a number of EU countries. They can be better, and this would actually supplant them. Thirdly, we are talking about 28 states on one side, and we're talking about 50 US states on the other side. And so I think you can get a lot of variation in the implementation and discrimination against local and national and international companies within these states, and I mean states as in sovereign states or states of the US. I think that's another reason. And finally, actually two more final points. If we can get the right sort of agreement, I think that can become the template for agreements around the world. Carrying on the wrong sort of agreement, I think, actually is more harmful. So getting a modernised ISDS, because we're not starting with the clean sheet of paper, we're starting with 3,000 ISDS clauses around the world today, 3,000. And that's, I think, excluding the Energy Charter Treaty, which is huge as well. And finally, I think a conversation that says, something, the US legal system, we trust that. And US unis should trust every 28 member state of the EU. But when it comes to negotiating an agreement with Brazil or with China or whatever, we don't trust you. It's going to be a much shorter conversation. And I think the right thing is to have the right level of agreement and then take it to other countries. So that's the long answer, but that's the reason I believe it.
It's very helpful, but I mean, obviously some of that answer was about how we've already got ISDS, etc., and I understand that. But it is the case still that we've got established legal systems that are open to, to daylight. We can see what's happening. It is an arbitration behind closed doors. Secondly, of course, there's the right. Secondly, there's the right of appeal, isn't there? There is no sort of right of appeal for this arbitration. And thirdly, these ISDS, once it's decided, will be given to a regime of arbitration. It's thought that it'll be the ICSID system, but it could be another one. It could be the sort of football rules or the rugby rules. There's different systems of rules, and the arbitrator or the arbitration will make precedents that I said at the start of this hearing could go on for 20 years, that could lead to regulatory chill. So do you think there should be open court? Do you think there should be the right of appeal? And I still don't quite understand why we need ISDS at all, other than the fact you've mentioned that some exist in the world. That doesn't mean we should create a supranational one.
Well, we have plenty of supranational bodies. I think it acts as a good backstop of investment protection between very large, and I would expect as a result of it, and I know the Canadians take the view as a result of the agreement with the US, very substantially increased investment on both sides of the Atlantic, which I think the UK would benefit out of even more so. So that's the reason we need it. The courts, neither the US nor the EU want to have other than the transparency protocols put into the unit trial protocols. So this notion of the secret court actually does apply to the old agreements, but it's a good example of why we need improved, better agreements to do. In terms of the appointment of arbitrators, CETA said one arbitrator to be appointed by plaintiff, one by defendant, if that's the right legal term, and one by and one then appointed independently. I think, is that right? In terms of an appeals mechanism, I think we should investigate how an appeals mechanism could or should work. So I think I'm pleased that you're asking, I think those are the right questions, which is how can we improve this clause rather than, well, we don't like ISDS full stop. I think questioning about the mechanism of appointment and the appeals process and the transparency, which, by the way, will, I understand, allow third parties to also contribute into the case by putting in papers and the like. I think these are the right questions to make sure when we're creating a gold standard in terms of the right balance, we get there. I mean, you referred to regulatory chill. I repeat again, there's 3,000 of these already in the world, 90 already in the UK, plus the Energy Charter Treaty. I don't know how often in this House, or indeed in the House of Lords, but you're way more experienced in the parliamentarians than I am, whether you can remember when a piece of legislation was decided not to progress because of one of these ISDS clauses.
Well, we're just worrying about the future, really.
But
the idea would be if a Labour government came in, for argument's sake, took over public ownership of a rail franchise, then ISDS kicked in and the government was fined for the future prospective profits on sort of exponential passenger rises in an arbitration court behind closed doors without the right of appeal, and we were stung for billions of pounds. We would then not nationalise anything else, and we would not be able to get out of this straitjacket for 20 years. These are big stakes, and I think you're sort of seeing this very likely and say, well, we've got a few ISDSs around, don't worry. And I don't think that's good enough.
Mr. Davis, you keep on talking about secret courts. Nobody is suggesting that either CETA nor TTIP should be secret. UK domestic contractual law tends to be our protection. We have had many things where we have moved back and forward on privatisation. There has occasionally been some domestic claims about that, usually from recollection have been lost about that. The UK legal offers many protections. This is a backstop. The fact that we have not lost a claim, after all this time, should start to tell you a body of evidence, and we can make it better still to clarify what discriminatory treatment is. Certainly, if you nationalise something without any compensation and change the domestic law to say that nobody was allowed compensation,
Yeah, well, we wouldn't
then
do
that
that.
would, although I have heard, to be fair, I have heard some NGOs express to me that this is their frustration with ISDS because it stops them. One of them said to me, it would stop us taking back the energy industry that we gave away in the first place, which sold. So that. Yeah, I some of the characterisation is not ones that I recognise.
Can I just
I think
finally,
we really must try to move on a bit. But you can ask this last question, and then Jacob reads.
the general point is that in Britain, domestic litigation, which is long established by great minds over the years, is a balance between the demands of sovereignty on the one hand and commercial necessity. And so we've got a mature system. And the concern here is that we sort of jump prematurely into this arbitration situation where you mentioned fair and equitable treatment. But this, to a certain extent, is subject to the discretion of the arbitrators that then will carry on forever. And I still press you on this fundamental point. Are you or don't you think it's worth pursuing an option of having free trade within the context of our established legal system and not having these strange ISDS things without appeals, without proper transparency, with discretion, and use the established systems of law to have fair trade and not reinvent all these prospective threats to our sovereignty and our public purse?
I think I answered really fully the reasons that I thought that it was an assistance. I don't know why you keep on using the phrase secret or non-transparent when we keep on saying that the clauses as they are in CETA will have transparency provisions in them. I agree with you that some of the 90 we've got to date aren't transparent enough. That's why we want to improve them. But the UK, we've had them for a long time. They have acted as a backstop in the case of UK, because the UK legal system, of course we have more than one legal system in the UK, I should
So I think that point's been well covered. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I just wanted to add that this is basically a red herring. It's all covered with European companies by the Court of Justice of the European Union, which if the government behaved unfairly to a French company against a UK company,
right.
would not only rule, but would rule as UK law, as our effectively highest court, and that most of these concerns of unfair treatment would be covered by the Human Rights Act. So the idea that there's this great departure is simply false. I told you I'd ask you a soft question, so the question is, do you agree, Minister?
I think penetrative and very knowledgeable. You're absolutely right. There are many other sources of extra territorial, the beyond domestic courts, where people could sue if they were being treated unfairly. And you're absolutely right. And this, actually, one of the things that some of the cases that are raised, actually, people have gone suing domestically, suing in the ECJ, suing in various areas. So no, your comment is entirely in point.
There is no right to appeal from ISDS to the ECJ. There is no right to appeal. This is one of the fundamental. There is no this right to appeal. This is just not true.
No, but you can go.
Let's answer. Let the witness answer the question.
You can go to many of the types of situations being referred to. Ex-ISDS, you can go to the ECJ and seek the same sort of clearance, same sort of right for restitution as well.
You can't overturn the ISDS.
No, that's not
exactly.
So that's not the point that was being made.
That's what the insinuation
that's not the point that was being made.
Let him answer. Okay, fine. And there is, of course, the other final point on this before we come back to the SME issue. That, of course, you are here, but actually this is an EU operation, because ultimately this is decided by the EU as a whole, and of course there is the unanimity side of that, because if you can't get unanimity, then there is no TTIP. So you can't control the EU, and how far do you think, if I could ask you a broad question, would you regard your negotiating position on behalf of the UK as being reflected by the kind of consensus and agreement that is emerging within the EU as a whole, as we now speak, as the situation has evolved since June, when we last had you here?
Well, I think we benefit from having a very proactive position on trade. We are seen as being one of the leaders. We have a like-minded group that we spend a lot of time with on trade, and actually have a very effective position. I met the Commissioner again only a couple of weeks ago, and we actually find, for the very most part, that pushing an open door is probably the wrong phrase, but it is a very close meeting of minds on trade issues. Would we have required, asked about audiovisual exclusion? No, we wouldn't. That's the one I can think of. I mean, when the Americans already export all the Oscars to us, so we don't really need additional protection from American products. That's the only one I can think of. We would not feel that GIs are such a big issue for us, because actually things like Scotch whisky are already protected. But the EU, in terms of fighting for the sort of interest the UK would have in terms of public procurement, in terms of financial services, in terms of the motor industry. We are, of course, the second largest producer of cars in Europe. Many people forget. But we found very much meeting of minds, and I have to say the officials here do an excellent job in interacting with the EU, and I genuinely struggle to think of things on TTIP that or indeed on CETA, where the EU have had a fundamentally different position than us. We have slight things on CETA around Mode 4, and we got certain exclusions from them, but that's about it.
So in a nutshell, without being over enthusiastic about the role that you are playing, would you say that, generally speaking, the views that you're expressing are being assimilated and understood and pretty much accepted within the EU as a whole? In other words, you're not having got 27 member states, you're not noticing a vast amount of resistance from the other 27?
Certainly not from the Commission. I find the Commission's views are very much aligned with us, and actually the vast majority of the member states as well.
And that's why the unanimity issue is rather important. So you have this in mind all the time, that you're going to have to end up with unanimity.
I think all the states will have to consider that there's some states who certainly some things that they will be less happy than the UK will be regarding being a free trade nation. And I have no doubt that the subject of geographical indicators will have an issue for some countries, and they'll have to balance it up with all the other benefits. Well, I would say what's quite interesting is we tend to think of the Scandinavian countries and the Dutch as being very, very pro, but some of the strongest proponents have been Spain and Portugal, for example, in terms of pushing in the Baltic states. In terms of pushing this agreement. So I don't find the UK is in the slightest isolated on these matters.
Now we have another question from Grant Davis on SMEs, I think.
Just one here.
I think we've covered the other two questions.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm just going to ask, what's your own assessment of the impact that the ISDS clauses might have on SMEs in particular? And a slightly separate question, but can you just as have you got any view on how on how TTIP, as a separate question, the impact it might have on Greece? It's a completely different thing. But can you answer first of all this issue about the ISDS clauses will have on SMEs? Do you think they are particularly problematic for them?
No, I don't. I mean, SMEs do actually utilise directly ISDS clauses, but actually I think more importantly, where ISDS clauses help SMEs, they provide a protection in terms of discriminatory behaviour against non-local companies, and often the SMEs have less, shall we say, lobbying power in a foreign government, as much as we try and help UK SMEs in particular. So I think they'll benefit. And generally, I would make the point on TTIP that this will be the first agreement, I believe, that's going to be a special SME chapter. So, because we recognise this should be a big benefit for SMEs, and one of the things we want to have an SME chapter, and I think the next negotiating round has an SME event just to try and flesh that out.
Because in general, as a general rule, would you agree that big companies in some sense like red tape, because they've got huge departments for lawyers and all the rest of it, because it forms a barrier to entry for small companies, which might be a couple of people in a room innovating, and they don't want to penetrate this harmonised red tape which TTIP could become?
No, I don't recognise it. I think big companies hate red tape. I think they are more able to cope with it. Small companies just can't cope with it, and so they just don't export. I mean, I was in a food and drink exhibition, and we have one, this food exporters, this food company, very small one, saying different size bottles. I can't sell to the US, and a big food manufacturer said, well, we've got a problem, and I said, but the answer is you have one production line for the US and 7 others for the rest of the EU. And it's costly but doable. It's just not doable for SMEs at all. I think there was a survey that said in relation to EU regulation it cost an SME 10 times as much per employee to institute an EU regulation as it did big companies. I think the same is true when you look at regulations generally, but that does not mean big companies like red tape. Big companies hate it as much because it makes their life difficult. It just doesn't make their life absolutely impossible.
One last question on Greece.
Greece, oh sorry. Greece, in terms of creating a more competitive economy, TTIP could really help them in terms of allowing them to export. Whether the current Greek government sees it that way, of course, is an issue, and I think it comes in a category of too early to tell. But certainly, Greece's solution in life is going to have to be the competitiveness of its ongoing economy, and they've made a lot of progress up till now, and hopefully they will progress that. And free trade in all its forms will help a competitive Greece.
So I think that's covered as much as we can for today. Finally, it would be very helpful, because of this dissolution, if you could possibly enable us to have your written follow-ups by the end of next week, which is Friday the 7th of March, so that we can consider them and report on them before dissolution. I think that you know what the follow-ups are, because we put them, you can look at the transcript, we can just go through them, but we have a function to perform. We are constrained by the date of dissolution, so as far as we're concerned, we would need them by Friday the 7th of March.
We can certainly write right by then. There's a number of things that we are considering as the negotiations are live. The earlier we write, the earlier we will be in that consideration process.
We'll try our best, and we'll communicate. We'll continue on communicating in the meantime on it. But we will certainly try.
Weekend.
Sorry,
You got the whole weekend. Just
it's not my weekend. Actually, I'm in China trying to promote British trade from Saturday. So
I'm sure
my whole weekend has already been taken. Thank you.
I'm sure Mr. Griffiths and the officials can pick up while you're away. So on that happy note, could I say thank you very much for coming?
Thank you very much.